Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second day of the 2020 Presidential Elections Program, sponsored by Rice University's James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy. I'm John Williams, co-director of the program. Throughout recent history, it seems, the losing presidential candidate traditionally made their concession speech a few hours after midnight, or perhaps a little later, after the outcome was clear. For the third time since 2000, however, the losing candidate in this year's U.S. presidential election has waited to consider all of his potential legal remedies before conceding what was a relatively close race. In 2000, Al Gore waited 37 days after the election that year for the Supreme Court to render a decision that finalized his 537-vote loss in Florida and give the election to George W. Bush. 4 years later, John Kerry waited until almost noon after the election to concede a close race to President Bush until after he determined he had no legal recourse in Ohio. And this year, of course, it remains unclear if or when the current president will concede, as he and his minions have mounted legal and public relations challenges in states that he lost. Today, we're pleased to welcome a member of the George W. Bush legal team and the Al Gore legal teams of 2000. They will discuss what happened after election 2020 and compare it with the Florida recount of 2000. The panelists are Ben Ginsberg, a leading expert on American election law. He served as national counsel to the Bush-Cheney presidential campaign in 2000 and 2004. And for those of you who remember or are familiar with the movie Recount, which told the story of that legal case in 2000, Ginsberg was portrayed by actor Bob Balaban. Mitchell W. Berger founded the Florida-based law firm Berger Sangerman in 1985. 20 years later, he represented Al Gore and Joe Lieberman in their Florida legal case. Actor Bruce Altman played Berger in that movie. Our moderator today is Professor Richard H. Pildes, the Sudler Family Professor of Constitutional Law at New York University School of Law and a leading expert on the Constitution, the Supreme Court, and the structure of democracy. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Professor Pildes, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, John. And let me start off thanking the Baker Institute for inviting me to moderate this panel. It's a great honor to be here, and the Baker Institute has become one of the preeminent institutions in the United States on the study of the presidency. And I'm very glad to be here with Ben Ginsberg and Mitchell Berger. So what we want to do today is begin by revisiting our most litigated presidential election before 2020. We're going to talk about some comparisons between then and now, the 2000 Bush v. Gore election dispute. And then at the end, we're going to talk about what we might learn from both of these election contests about the vulnerabilities in our election system and ways we might think about shoring up some of those vulnerabilities. But let's start with Florida 2000. And it's hard to recapture the drama of election night and the early hours of the next morning in 2000. Let me just remind you, or for those of you who don't remember or didn't experience it, kind of describe briefly what it was like. Early in the evening on election night, it was clear that Florida was going to be the decisive state, and the networks declared Florida for Al Gore. Slightly later in the evening, a few hours after that, the networks pulled that back and said it was unclear who was going to win Florida. Later in the evening, the networks then turned around and declared that George Bush would win Florida. And in fact, the networks were so confident in this projection, they actually projected Bush to win by 50,000 votes, that Al Gore actually called George Bush up and conceded the election to him. Still later in the evening, the networks pulled back their call. This is by early AM, I believe, pulled back their call for George Bush and declared the election too close to call. And Al Gore actually called George Bush up at some point and rescinded his concession. And we found out on the morning of November 8th, the day after the election, that George Bush was ahead by 1,784 votes out of nearly 6 million cast in Florida. There was an automatic machine recount, which narrowed that lead even further. And then soon after that, Al Gore filed for a manual recount, as he was permitted to do under Florida law, in 4 counties that he identified, which were Democratic-leaning counties. And we were sort of off to the races at that point. And in the 5 weeks after Election Day, the case was litigated up and down the Florida court system. It made 2 appearances in the US Supreme Court until a little more than 5 weeks after Election Day. The Supreme Court ended the recount at that stage in a 5-4 vote on the December 12th date, the key date, the first key date in the Electoral Count Act, the electoral calendar that year for the Electoral College process, and George W. Bush became president. And that's a very quick synopsis of an incredible amount of drama. But let me start the discussion off with the 2 of you. I guess, Ben, let me ask you first. So what were you doing on election night? What was happening? And when did you first get brought in to the disputes that began to emerge in the court system and in the county canvassing commissions once everybody realized how tight this was and that we were going into this beginning of a recount process?
The memories, Rick. I was in the headquarters. I had been the national counsel to the campaign, so I was sitting there in headquarters like everyone else. In the great human emotion scale of life we all went through that night. And so when Governor Bush was declared the winner about 1:30 in the morning Austin time, we all went to the square where in front of the Capitol to hear the results. And then when Al Gore withdrew his concession, we all went streaming back to the headquarters, not sure what was going to happen. The margins kept getting narrower and narrower. We were all on the phone with people we knew in Florida. And about 3:30 in the morning, Don Evans, who was the chairman of the campaign, came up to my desk and said, looks like we're going to have a recount. You better saddle up the forces. And so that's when things started happening really quick. And I got to say, people in campaigns know how to get things done quickly and efficiently. And nowhere has that ever been proven in what happened in the next hours and days and 36 days from that point.
Say a little bit more what you mean by that.
We had prepared for recounts in the sense the campaigns always prepare for recounts. We had books on what the law was. We had people on the ground, both politically and lawyers who had been looking at election day activities. But in all the recounts I've done over the years, never is anyone really prepared for the reality of, holy cow, it's really happening. And that was that moment. So for a recount in Florida with all its counties, it required a massive mobilization and recruitment of personnel. And so there were calls that went out over the next 48 hours for lawyers, for communications people, for wily political operatives to go on the ground in the counting houses, for logistical people to take care of all those folks. And within 48 hours, and I'm sure this happened with Gore folks, had like over 600 people streaming into different parts of Florida. To be able to handle the logistics to get that done was a real tribute to the professionalism of the folks in the campaign.
And as we know, it quickly became the case that the sort of commander of the operations on the Bush side was going to be James Baker. Ron Klain, now chief of staff to President-elect Biden, quickly became the commander in chief on the Democratic side. How quickly do you remember Jim Baker being brought in? How quickly did he take control of the situation on your side?
Very quickly. So I took off for Florida about 9 in the morning. And by the time we had landed in Tampa to drop off the first tranche of people to get on the ground, we got the word that Secretary Baker was the person in charge of the recount. And I made my way to Tallahassee, and about 4 hours later, he landed on the ground on Wednesday night in Tallahassee.
So Mitchell, why don't you take us through your experience of this from the Gore side? You were, of course, already in Florida, right?
Yes,
What was election night and the next morning like for you? When did you get brought in? What did it feel like on the Democratic side?
well, I've known Al Gore over 40 years from Chattanooga, Tennessee. So that's I was in Florida in part as a result of moving here in 1985. My morning started at 7:15 in the morning when Les Alexander, the owner of the San Antonio basketball team, called me up from Palm Beach and said, I just voted for Pat Buchanan. That's how my morning started. Then spent the next few hours trying to get a hold of the election supervisor in Palm Beach County to see if we could do something about the ballot, the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County. The morning continued with the vote every page phenomenon in Duval County, where people were voting every page for president, because in that situation, there was an instruction to vote every page. By the time at 10 to 7 that night, I got a friend from Holland and Knight to try and help us keep the polls open, perhaps in Palm Beach County, so we could try to remedy the butterfly ballot situation. But we all decided that was going to be perhaps not something that could be done in court. And I then got on the phone with Charles Burson, Lynn Utrecht, and Joe Sandler. Charles Burson was the then chief of staff to the vice president. Lynn Utrecht was the counsel to the campaign, and Joe Sandler was the counsel to the Democratic National Committee. And they encouraged me to get on the plane to go to Nashville because they knew I had worked for Gore for knew him for 40 years, and said, there's nothing you can do. It looks like we're going to win. Come to Nashville. So I left for Nashville. When we landed in Tampa on Southwest Airlines, Gore was declared the winner. When we landed in Nashville, it was pulled back. I saw where the votes had not yet been counted, which was the South County votes. So I did not understand how anyone was declaring anything at that point. And I was one of the people who screamed at Mike Feldman, who was traveling with Al Gore, that he could not concede yet until we knew what happened with the South Florida votes. And then in the middle of the night, I flew back through a private plane to South Florida. And by the next day, I was in Tallahassee, because unfortunately in Florida, the logistics for Gore were not great. Jeb Bush was governor. Katherine Harris was Secretary of State. My friend at Holland and Knight called me and said he could not help us. Greenberg Trauer could not help us. Ackerman Centerfit could not help us. And still Hector and Davis could not help us. So that left the small law office of Berger, Davis, and Zingerman, who had 20 lawyers at the time, to try and figure out how to do everything in Florida that the governor and the Secretary of State had control over.
Yeah, this is, and just to sort of make sure everybody's on the same page here and remembers this. One of the things that's often lost in the story of Bush v. Gore, once it got into the courts and the fight was over the recount, was what you were describing that happened in Palm Beach County with this so-called butterfly ballot, where several thousand people apparently voted accidentally for Pat Buchanan.
22,000.
Vote. How many? What was the number?
22,000.
Yeah. Vastly exceeding the margin that ended up being fought over in the litigation. The ballot design issues were terrible. We discovered in Florida in 2000, we discovered a lot of other problems with the system. But nothing could be done about that, as you said, after the fact. And so we ended up in this recount.
Not exactly. I mean, unfortunately, Gore did not have as much control over. I'm not a member of any organized party. I'm a Democrat. So Gore did not have as much control over certain parts of the litigation as we were trying to. So people brought, at the wrong time of the election, they brought during the protest phase of the election. Florida has two phases, protest and contest at the time, which Bush versus Gore, the case completely got those two parts of the election confused. But during the protest phase of the election, certain partisans brought an election case about the butterfly ballot. The Florida Supreme Court, Judge Labarda, who is currently on the Florida Supreme Court, ruled that the butterfly ballot was a lawful ballot without Gore having anything to do with the case. The butterfly ballot would have been more properly brought as a contest case. I wrote extensive.
Mitch, it wouldn't have worked there. Florida law was clear that both parties have to sign off on the ballot before Election Day in order to avoid sour grapes litigation. And in fact, as part of the Connie Mack recount, Senate recount in 1988, in which I was involved, that issue was raised. It repeated guidance from Governor Martinez's 1986 victory that ballot design was an issue that has to be brought before an election. Can't
Well,
be
let me just without relitigating that.
No, that's okay. I mean, I wrote extensively about that, and I will tell you, I've sat with Florida Supreme Court justices who've told me that they would have considered it as part of the contest.
Well, I can say as an election law expert, I've never seen a court after the election throw out votes or adjust them because voters say they made a mistake on how they voted. So, but in any event, that issue was gone. Ben, talk about what did you expect? What were you guys thinking? How did you sort of envision the way this might play out in those early days when you first started this battle? I mean, did you imagine that the federal courts would be involved? Did you think?
We knew we were outnumbered and outmatched because of the election machinery. So on November the 15th, we offered to do a statewide recount on CNN and do it in accordance with the law that George Bush signed into law in Texas for punch card ballots. It was rejected. So at that point in time, you know, we knew our only options left were litigation.
Well, Rick, so the first two things that we saw on that Wednesday right after the election was, first of all, the butterfly ballot issue. And we knew under Florida law that that was resolved, that you couldn't bring it after the election. And the second was the word later confirmed on the Thursday after the election that the Gore campaign wanted a recount, but only in their 4 best counties, 3 of the 4 of which they controlled the election boards. And the 4th was Miami-Dade, which was allegedly nonpartisan. So we were pretty sure that their protestations about they wanted to count all the votes only went so far because they were only counting in their 4 best counties. And a recounts lawyer's guidepost is good jurisdictions get better and bad jurisdictions get worse during recounts. So we realized, I think, right from the beginning, because of the Gore 4-county strategy, that it was going to be a tightly contested, hotly contested battle on all grounds, and federal courts, state courts, county boards were all going to be part of the mix.
Did you have any sense of how long you thought it might take for this to get resolved? Were you thinking it would be done in a week or so, or?
Well,
Richard,
yeah, I mean,
Rick-
I
Let me
go,
just ask Ben, and then I'll come to you, Mitchell.
Yeah,
I
Richard,
go into all recounts, assuming that they're sort of hoping that they're not going to hold up and will be over quickly, and recognize that that's not always true. So I think that initially we thought it would be over quickly, and it took till probably the weekend to recognize exactly how long it could be and how it could drag out.
Yeah.
Mitchell?
Yeah, Richard, look, on November the 15th of 2000, we wrote a statement that was delivered by Al Gore on CNN. We wanted a full recount in all 67 counties. During the protest phase of the election, we simply could not get 67 counties in time before a certification in order to get all of those counties to start doing it voluntarily. So we asked the Bush campaign to join with us to do all 67 counties. That was rejected 2 hours later. It's all in the historical record. It's all there. This is something that, you know, we choose not to talk about with respect to the 2000 election, because that would have avoided all of the litigation.
I'm surprised it took us 2 hours, to be honest, to reject it. I thought it was quicker than that. I don't know. The court of law, known as CNN, is probably not the right place to do it. And the fact of the matter is, there have been statewide recounts in Florida, and so the mechanism does exist to go into each county
After a
if
contest.
you wanted to. Yeah, but
After a contest.
you all wanted to go into your 4 best counties with your
No,
counting
Ben.
boards, and when that didn't work, you fell back on the CNN strategy.
No,
Well, I
Ben.
can see that the nerves are still.
It's still there. It's
raw
all
nerves
still
are
there.
not so
No,
far beneath
Ben.
the surface here.
There was no contest litigation brought until after Thanksgiving. November 15th is 10 days before Thanksgiving. We offered to do it statewide, and when the Florida Supreme Court finally ordered it to be statewide.
It's also the
By the way-
certification day.
By the way, the Florida Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court certified an election with partial recounts, which is exactly why Rudy Giuliani is running around trying to certify elections with partial counts.
So let me try to keep this at a little bit of a bigger picture perspective on Florida 2000. What most surprised you about that process? Let me ask you each of that. In hindsight, looking back at it, Ben, let me ask you, and then Mitch.
Oh, I think the scope of the whole enterprise is what surprised me the most. I mean, it was not only the fact that Florida is a big state and there were 6 million ballots cast, but the scrutiny of a presidential recount was unprecedented. I mean, statewide US Senate and gubernatorial recounts are not like the way the presidential was. And so the scope of it in terms of issues raised in, I don't know, 47 separate pieces of litigation, the number of lawyers involved, the number of political people and communications people. So honestly, it was the scope of it that I think was so surprising.
Of course, people need to appreciate the time pressures of a recount in a presidential election,
right,
are
that don't
unlike
exist
any
in
other
Senate.
election.
Yeah.
So you have this massive scope, but you have to bring it to closure in time for the electors to get certified and the electors to vote in the Electoral College, which is roughly 6 weeks after Election Day. Mitchell, what surprised you the most?
Well, everything that Ben said is absolutely accurate and true. And I think that for the most part, it was handled while you see the rough spots still exist. It was handled as Warren Christopher asked us to handle it, like the world's greatest democracy was having an issue about who should be its next president. That's for the most part the way it was handled. Ron Klain got a battlefield promotion, right? There were 2 secretaries there, but we were unlike other people, our experience was more like George Washington against the British Army. We had 2,000 square feet in an office in Tallahassee, which is my office. Warren Christopher, Bill Daly, our entire communications team, Ron Klain and I shared an office. David Boyes was in the hallways. So we had to bring in all the computer equipment and other equipment. The communications people were next to the lawyers. It was a logistical, very, very deep logistical issue for us. We had no big law offices to go to. So we had to build the plane while we were flying it from our point of view. And so, David Boyes, yours true. I would be writing briefs in 3 or 4 different courts of appeals at the same time. I remember flying home for 2 hours on Thanksgiving and flying back because the Brooks Brothers riot ended the Miami-Dade recount. We were trying to keep that open. So these are things that are not something I'd want to ever do again. And it is something that I hope that we can try to find ways to avoid ever seeing happen again. Because it can proliferate to the point of where we are today, and I think that whatever your political views are, you do not want power to be transferred through anything but the rule of law.
You made a very interesting point, and maybe we can start talking about the comparisons of 2000 to what's going on today. When you said that it was actually carried out for all the intensity of the conflict and the constant litigation, being in court and all that, I agree with you. It was carried out in a way that was actually a fairly dignified process, if you will. It was a very legalized process. Of course, both sides wanted to shape public opinion in their direction, but I don't really recall, these horrible kinds of charges being circulated about the other side or incredible nastiness. There really was something quite dignified about it in hindsight. Does that seem right to you, Ben, also?
Yeah, it definitely does, especially by comparison to what we're doing in 2020. And Secretary Baker has made this point recently, but in 2000, there was no candidate who said, let's stop counting the votes before they're all counted. There was one count of the votes, and then we sort of danced over what should be recounted and how. But there was no one who at the beginning said, let's stop counting right now. It was always clear that this was a breathtakingly close, unanticipatedly close election, and things would get a little bit wild from there. But there was nothing like this year where let's not count the absentee ballots because we don't kind of like them.
I agree with what Ben has said on that. Obviously, you can see where Ted Olson and David Boyes have ended up. They ended up best friends and litigating certain cases together right now. The process that we all must undertake in this regard is one of respecting the will of the voter and ensuring that the votes counted. I know that, again, Justice Barrett was involved in the Seminole and Martin County case. Gore refused to be a part of that case. I know because I told the lawyers involved we would not be a part of that case. And again, that case was about disqualifying 10 or 20,000 absentee ballots that had not been correctly processed. Again, partisans do what they do, but it is up to leaders to make sure that they respect the process. Gore sent me to those lawyers to tell them we would not intervene and not be a part of that case, and we do not want to disqualify votes. So there was definitely a difference, in my view, of how this proceeded.
Yeah, Mitchell's right. To flesh that out a little bit, that was an attempt to disenfranchise 25,000 absentee votes because of an election official's error with the applications to get ballots. Those are precisely the votes that the Trump campaign is trying to throw out in 2020 with absentee votes. Not the fault of the voters involved,
right,
but because there was a process error involving elections officials.
and I think that's the difference, right? The litigation was brought, but it was not. But I know that we would not participate in that litigation. So when I say we, the Gore campaign and Gore, that doesn't mean that the theory wasn't there for someone to bring it. We can't stop it. It's America, as someone once said. But it is not something that the campaign or the candidate sanctioned, unlike what's going on now.
Well, let's talk more about some of the differences between now and then. I mean, I think that one thing that made it possible to have a more dignified process back then, and there were many, and I don't know if you're going to agree with this, but certainly my perception at the time, from my vantage point then, I was working for NBC doing the legal analysis of these cases with Tom Brokaw. It's hard to remember this, but a large part of the country did not think at that time that there was an enormous difference between George W. Bush and Al Gore. I mean, partisans, the most intense partisans did, but the country was not anywhere like what it has become in terms of polarization. There wasn't the sense that the election was existential in the way that many people feel this election was, you know, in the sense that if the other side wins, the country will never be the same again. You know, I remember how much people were interested in hearing about the process, and they want to know how it worked. And they were not so wrapped up in their candidate absolutely must win or the country will never be the same. I think that had a lot of effect on the ability, the sort of the larger environment that enabled the process to be a more kind of respectful, dignified process that respected our institutions. I don't know if you guys agree with that.
Well, I think things are certainly more raw and polarized now. I think both elections were marked by the old cliche of this is the most important election of our lifetime and would make a big difference in the direction of the country. But I certainly agree that 2020 was not as was more existential than 2000 was. I mean, to flesh out that point, the truth is that we met the Gore lawyers for drinks in the bars of Tallahassee when we were done with work for the day. And it is pretty improbable in my mind that Rudy Giuliani and Bob Bauer are going to be bending elbows anytime soon.
That's an interesting little, I never heard that before, that went on. What do you think would have happened in 2000 if we had social media like we have it today? How would that have affected things, Mitchell?
Well, look, Ben got to go drink with David and Steve Zach maybe, but I was still working. but
it was a college town. The bars were open after midnight.
Right, exactly. But you know, I remember David would come in at 6:30 or 7 o'clock, at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he'd take a look at what I did, and he would chop it up and make it into 5 pages less every time. But he's a brilliant man. But I think that to Ben's point and to your point, Richard, I think there is something to, on the Bush side, you had a family history along with Secretary Baker of people, Al Gore and Jim Baker have written articles together You had a family history of understanding that there's something greater than all of us when we're involved in this. And I think that that has generally been true of both parties as they go through the process to select their nominees. That's clearly was not the case with the current president. So whether it's Mitt Romney or George W. Bush or John McCain or Al Gore or John Kerry, or the Clintons, these are people who, whether you agree with them or not, they believe that the American experiment is far more important than they are. And that is something that I think all of us understood in the process that we were thrown into in those 35 days.
Yeah, let me echo those comments. I mean, I think Mitchell is absolutely right. And for me, the most vivid example of the contrast is the way Al Gore, after losing by 537 votes in a contentious process where pretty obviously from the discussion today, we still harbor some differences on the correctness of the outcome. But Al Gore it gave an incredibly gracious, what's in the best interests of the country concession speech when the recount was over. And Donald Trump, who lost by many hundreds of thousands of votes, can't bring himself to do that yet. And so that's the real vivid example of the differences between the two elections.
What do you think about the Supreme Court? I don't want to sort of discuss as much the merits of the decision, but was it a good thing the Supreme Court got involved in both of you? Should it have stayed out, or was it correct that if we're going to be having this kind of a battle in the courts, that ultimately this should not be left in the Florida courts for final decision, but it should be something the U.S. Supreme Court weighs in on? Mitchell, let me put that to you first.
Oh God, Ben's going to kill me, but Article 2, Section 1, second paragraph. Each state shall appoint in a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. That means that the state makes that decision. And by the way, Bush versus Gore, that's an anomaly too. Neither one of them were running. Only the electors were running.
So your view is that when we have these kinds of conflicts in a presidential election, if it does end up in the courts for one reason or another, these issues should stay in the state courts and not have federal court involvement. Is that basically what you're saying?
Well, that's what the Constitution says. If the state legislature has chosen to have the election of a state elector, which is a state official, chosen to have those decisions be made by state elections, and in such manner as they deem appropriate. Now, the problem with Bush versus Gore, other than the name, because neither one of them were running for office, the problem with Bush versus Gore is December 12th, Florida had not chosen to be part of the safe harbor, even though the United States Supreme Court said they had. And the Florida Supreme Court made that quite clear, by the way, in a decision it wrote after Bush versus Gore, and made a point of saying that the United States Supreme Court got that wrong. There's nothing in Florida law where we chose to be part of the safe harbor. And that decision you all can find, if you'd like, in 773 Southern 2nd, 526. So other than forgetting our Federalist principles, the United States Supreme Court also made up Florida law to boot.
All right, so Ben, what's obviously I assume you're going to disagree, but tell us why you think the Supreme Court should, if you agree, it's a good thing for the Supreme Court to get involved in a presidential election if it's being litigated in the courts, or at least the federal courts.
Well, I think they had to in 2000. I mean, you can't have a state court changing the rules of the game in a federal election after it's been played, which is what the Florida Supreme Court did. And the Florida Supreme Court, remember, the first case went up to the US Supreme Court from Florida, the one involving the 4-county counting boards. And the US Supreme Court basically ruled 9-0 that the Florida Supreme Court was out of line and asked the Florida Supreme Court to justify its changing of the rules of the game after it was played. For reasons I will never understand, the Florida Supreme Court decided to ignore the US Supreme Court, never responded to that. A week later, 10 days later, Bush versus Gore went up to the US Supreme Court. And by that point, what was abundantly clear, and if the US Supreme Court had not ended it, we had reams of proof that similarly marked ballots were being counted arbitrarily differently, not only by different counties, but within counties. And they were outcome determinative votes. In other words, you can mark a Gore ballot one way and it was counted. You could mark a Bush ballot the same way and it wasn't counted. That was in part because punch cards were difficult to decipher. But the equal protection elements of that, down to individual voters having their votes counted, was something that had to be redressed or addressed by the US Supreme Court. And had it not, there would have been chaos long past January 20th in trying to unwind that. So I think they did the right thing under those circumstances.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you've talked a little bit about these county boards and counting votes differently in different counties. And that sort of leads me into the last thing I wanted to see if we could broaden out to discuss, which is, given what we learned in 2000, but even more importantly, what we've seen in this election about the way our election system works, the extraordinary decentralization of the process, even, for an election like the presidency, and the various kinds of vulnerabilities in that process. What sort of thoughts do you have about the directions we should be thinking in terms of shoring up the vulnerabilities in the election system, especially ones that have gotten exposed, in this election cycle? Mitchell, if you want to start.
Yeah, of course. I have a daughter who works for Microsoft at the Defending Digital Democracy Project, and Mr. Krebs, of course, has gained some notoriety recently as well. Look, if you think if you think that there is an equal protection problem in the voting systems in the United States, because there are different voting systems, right? There were punch card ballots in Broward County, and there were optical scanners in Seminole County. That is the equal protection problem exists when you go to the voting booth, not after someone votes. So you would need to say, okay, we need to federalize the election. Well, obviously, that is something that would take much more than just legislation. We would need to change the Constitution for that purpose. So there is a big tension between the equal protection aspects of an election and the whether or not the 14th Amendment applies to presidential electors. And as we know, the second clause of the 14th Amendment says it does not. So we need to think about how we're going to address the whole problem if we're going to address the whole problem. And the modern age, voting on the Tuesday after the harvest comes in, we're starting to address that problem right now by early voting and mail-in voting. But are we going to address the voting machine issue We've started to with the optical scanners being required to be used in most states right now. The issue of whether or not the data can be hacked, thanks to Mr. Krebs and the Department of Homeland Security and several of these secretaries of states, we have been pretty good about making sure the data can't be hacked. We are pretty certain data was hacked in 2016 in 3 or 4 of Florida counties. That's not me who said that. That's the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. So these are all things we are going to need to, on a bipartisan basis, address and decide whether or not what the founders did originally can be transported into the 21st century. We know we don't have the right to vote for president. Should we have the right to vote for president? That's an issue that would need to be addressed. We know we don't have the right to run for president. Only electors select presidents. This is something that John Anderson and I addressed in a law review article. The right to vote for president and the right to run for president. So these are all things in the 21st century we're going to have to tear down the curtain and talk about.
Ben, let me go to you on this, and this is actually picking up on one of the questions that someone in the audience sent in. Do you think it would be a good idea, given what we've just been through, for national elections, to have Congress, if it could reach any kind of agreement on these issues, develop standards for things like absentee ballots, deadlines for when they have to be requested or returned, issues about, how absentee ballots are to be verified, any of these issues? First of all, do you think there's federal power to do this? Because Mitchell was suggesting there might not be, but do you think it would be a good idea to have more national standards for national elections on some of these issues, in part so we don't fight them over constantly in every state, one after the other?
I think there's a difference between national standards and national requirements. I was part of a bipartisan presidential commission on election administration reform back in the earlier part of the decade. And I think one of the lessons that we learned from state and local election officials is that one size does not fit all, that national requirements won't work just because different jurisdictions are so different. But the part of this that I think is absolutely correct is that as a matter of institutional design, you would never recreate our election system as it is today. We have like 10,500 jurisdictions that have direct responsibility for parts of the counting and casting of ballots. And we saw that in Florida, and we certainly saw it this time. You see it in every recount. You have 10,500 jurisdictions. There's sort of a difference in quality among those jurisdictions. So I think you merge you can't have a national requirement, but you can have national standards with the sort of out of control nature of having 10,500 jurisdictions, and suggest that states have more uniformity within them. I'm not sure that means every county has to have the same machines. The federal district court in Pennsylvania hearing the latest Trump case made the point that equal protection goes to individual voters, in other words, similarly marked ballots not being treated similarly, and not that each county has to be the same. But it is certainly a good idea within a state if you do have uniformity. Georgia, for example, was able to handle its really difficult presidential recount so well because they basically have all the same equipment for all 5 million voters there. So there are clear advantages, and our system is set up in a way currently that does not, that really is going to create weaknesses in recount and contest situations.
What about a vulnerability in the system that I think we never really thought about before this year, which is, these individual certification boards and the state authorities that certify And, one of the things that we saw, which I would never have anticipated before 2020 and never saw before 2020, is, significant political pressure being brought to bear from various sources, including one of the campaigns, on these officials who are mostly performing a fairly ministerial function, unless there really is a major problem. Is there a way we can protect against that going forward? Should we change the structure, let's say, for certification in these states?
You might change the structure in states. I mean, Michigan having two boards is like, you can see the recipe for disaster. But I think you can change laws to make it clear that the certification process is a ministerial duty, which is not clear in all states. And that seems to be a pretty simple fix. But I also think you need to wait a little bit of time to review the current situation, because a lot of the problems were caused by one actor acting in a way that no presidential candidate has acted before. So I think you got to be careful about overcorrecting and creating a cure that's worse than the disease for this.
Look, I think that in order for the system to work, there needs to be, you can't legislate or regulate everything. Obviously, if somebody wishes to take advantage of some part of the system, they are going to find a way to do that. And whether or not people of good conscience and good moral rectitude, no matter what their political views are, will allow that to happen is when the system gets tested. If you want to know where we can start, we could start by passing a constitutional amendment that every citizen can vote for president. That would be a good start. And then we can determine where we go from there. But the myth of all the legalisms that are occurring because of what I call the appendicitis of American democracy, the Electoral College, it needs to be removed before it bursts. These legalisms are all created because of that institution. So if we want to start off with ensuring a better result, we can start off by ensuring that people have the right to vote for president under our Constitution.
Ben, do you think this is, I think part of what Mitchell is saying, that look, at the end of the day, no matter what we do with policy or institutional design, we are going to be left dependent on the sort of the character of the people who administer the election process, and that there's sort of ultimately no way around that? I mean, that's a little bit of a troubling thought, given our current political polarization. But, is that the reality we have to accept, do you think?
Well, I think you can improve laws to create better, sounder guardrails. But I think, sometimes people go outside the guardrails still, and that's always going to be part of it. One practical reform that's been discussed that I'm not really sure I agree with, but you would make the administration of elections completely nonpartisan. So in other words, you would not have elected officials as secretaries of state or running counting boards. And that might take a little bit of the political pressures out of it.
Yes, and as you know, I know Ben, maybe Mitchell as well. Many democracies have various kinds of independent election administration institutions that oversee various parts of the election process. They also play a significant role in resolving election disputes. Why does it seem to be so hard in the United States to generate enough political support for taking some of these functions out of the hands of partisan elected officials, which in many ways seems like a very odd way to design an election system, that you have partisan elected actors in key roles administering it. But why have we not been able to do that? Why is it so hard to get that done in the United States?
Well, I think in part it's because voting is a priority for a few weeks every other year in most states. So it's not the first thing that governments think about reforming. And under our current system, where there is so much power, so much decentralized power, you've got local officials who don't want to give up their sinecures. I mean, Florida is a great example of it, Mitchell. I mean, the county clerks in each of the counties are truly powerful individuals in their own right. And voting is one of the things that's theirs. And to change the law in Florida to make it more controlled by the state would be truly revolutionary, because you'd be dealing with 87 powerful county officials.
67, but
67.
probably
Seems
87.
like 87.
It feels like 87, right?
Right.
Exactly. Feels like 87.
So that's interesting, because you're describing the resistance as kind of vested interests of particular actors. Do you think there's any partisan dimension to support or resistance to creating more sort of independent election in administrative institutions?
But Richard, what you're describing is the Connecticut Compromise. I mean, this has been here from the beginning, right? The first contested presidential election took 32 ballots or 34 ballots in the House of Representatives. And it happened to be the third election that we had. The first two was by unanimity. There's nothing new here. 1824, 1876, of which Florida had something to do with, the 1960, 2000. This is not a new phenomenon for the American experiment, republic, if you can keep it. Each one of us each time needs to come back to the table and decide whether or not we're going to find a way to have the institutions work or not. This is not new. I mean, the 1876 election, when we withdrew the Union troops from the South and Rutherford B. Hayes, who might have lost to Sam Tilden, became president. Sam Tilden and the Democrats made a deal. As long as the troops were withdrawn from the South, Rutherford B. Hayes would be president. Each generation has to face this and decide how to work through what we have.
And how to make it better. Yeah. So let me just say, I see John is coming on, so I gather our time is coming to an end. Let me just say, listening to both of you talk about Florida 2000, but also the way you talk about it all these years later, it's such a pleasure to hear the kind of political culture we had with lawyering around a disputed election back then. Your reminders of how it was conducted, how the lawyers related to each other, how the process went, the commitment of the candidates, the campaigns to try and resolve this in a way that generated respect for our institutions and our processes. That was all really terrific for me to hear. And I'm not sure I fully appreciated that as much as I should have. So thank you very much, both of you, both for what you did back then and how you carried yourselves, and for the discussion today. It was
Richard, I just want to say one thing real quick. I wanted to thank Ben for his public stance with respect to the current president and the recount garbage that the current president has tried to put into the system. So that is the type of thing that helps to preserve the republic for the next generation. So thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'd like to ask one follow-up question, if I might. Y'all foresee any possibility that one legal case will make it to the Supreme Court in this election, perhaps the Pennsylvania vote by mail case?
Well, the Pennsylvania case is actually before the court. What the court did was reject emergency relief, and it still has the case before it. And there are a couple of really important issues that won't be outcome determinative for 2000, but which would be good if the court answered. One is the independent legislature doctrine about whether the legislature really has the sole power to decide the time, place, and manner of the election, or whether that should be read more broadly to include state Supreme Court review and gubernatorial powers. And the second issue that's lurking there is whether election day means election day, and whether the receipt of absentee ballots that are postmarked on election day is okay to bring into the states afterwards. So I think the court could, and I hope actually does, take up those two issues, but not in any way that is going to impact the 2020 race.
Yeah, in terms of the first question, I think Bush versus Gore did answer the first question, and it said that the problem was not that the state had delegated the right to vote for president to the people, but that the Florida Supreme Court had acted unconstitutionally, not that the state, that you could withdraw that gift of authority to the people under 3 U.S.C. 1 through 5. So if they stick to where they were in Bush versus Gore, once the state legislature has delegated that question, I think that question's answered. The second question is the one I agree with Ben. If we're no longer voting on the Tuesday after the harvest comes in, I would hope that everyone could accept a postmarked ballot on election day.
I'll just point out about that case, John. I think the Supreme Court likely will hear the case that Ben is describing. It probably won't hear this case, certainly won't decide this case until late into the spring, May, June, something like that. There's a very small number of ballots affected in Pennsylvania, so it won't have any effect on anything concerning the election. But going forward for future elections, if the Supreme Court does hear that case, it could bring some clarity to a bunch of issues that were the source of major litigation around the country this time around that are still unsettled. But nothing that would affect the outcome in any state, and nothing that's going to get decided before the inauguration.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I want to echo Professor Pildus's comments about how rewarding it was to hear full-throated but measured passion from our two our attorneys today. Thank you so much. We'll now take a short break and resume with our next panel at 12:20 p.m. Central Time. At that time, we'll hear from Stephanie Cutter and Beth Myers, consultants for the 2012 campaigns of Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, respectively. In the meantime, please tell your friends and colleagues that they can register to watch the program by going to www.bakerinstitute.org, www.bakerinstitute.org. Thank you, and we hope to see you in a moment.